Let's sing together this last part. Hi, li, 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 li. Hi, li, li, li. Hi, li, li, li. Hi, li, li, Yeah. Okay. Welcome.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. Just want to go over a few things before we really get started. First of all, let's thank the kitchen team, Linda Copper and others, for the great job that they've done today. Also, the folks that helped with the setup, including Evan, and welcome. For those who don't know who I am, my name's Wayne Senville. I'm a member of Ohavi Zedek, and I'm coordinator of the Lunch and Learn series. We're also circulating a basket for, I don't know where it is, right there it is, for contributions to cover the food costs, so I'd appreciate people helping out with that if you haven't already. And of course, if you already contributed online, there's no need to contribute again. Before introducing just want to make some comments about the last Lunch and Learn that's coming up next month. And then the rabbi is going to say a few words about Yom HaShoah.
Can you guys hear good? Sorry.
And then we'll get to today's speaker. So just so folks are aware, the last Lunch and Learn of the series is on May 15th. And we're pleased that we're going to have Sarah Villanueva, who is not only the program director and education principal at Temple Beth Jacob in Montpelier. She's also an end-of-life doula. So she's going to be talking about her work as a doula and what she terms last messages from the dying. So hope you'll be able to be here for the last Lunch and Learn in the series. And as I think I've said last time, but I'll repeat today, if anyone has any suggestions for topics or speakers for the next series, which will probably start next September or October, please catch me at the end today or get a hold of me some other time, and I'd be glad to hear any other thoughts. Now today, sort of coincidentally with today's speaker and fittingly with the topic that we're going to be talking about, is Yom HaShoah, and I'll leave Rabbi Filmus to say a few words before we get to our speaker.
Thank you. So today we commemorate 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust, the hands of the Nazi Germany. It's Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it's a national memorial day in Israel. It's also the day that we pay tribute to the Jewish resistance that took place during the Holocaust. That's why I feel like it's very fitting that Michael's here today to talk about the ways that we resisted, which are not just through physical violence. The full name is Yom HaShoah V'Gvura, or Gvura, which means the Holocaust and Heroism Day. It's also the week of Gvura in the Omer, which is Gvura means strength and discipline and heroism. Why was this day chosen by the Jewish people? This was the 27th day of Nisan on the Hebrew calendars, the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was not the end of the Shoah, the Holocaust. Why remember on this day, especially considering that they knew it was impossible to defeat the Nazis, that most of the Warsaw Ghetto resistance fighters died fighting for their lives. Why don't we remember the Shoah on the day that the concentration camps were liberated? What does it say about our people that we remember the Holocaust on the day of heroism and strength and resistance? Perhaps this is one of our ways of refusing to let our enemies define the very thing that is most sacred to the Jewish people, our story. The survivors get to tell the story from their perspective to make a statement to future generations that we're not lambs led to slaughter, that being from the ghetto means that we resist and we fight for our lives, even if it's impossible to win. We've worked very hard to have Holocaust education in public schools. OZ does a lot of work in this area. But one thing we're noticing is that in teaching about the Holocaust as a general story about the general evil and othering of people that humans do, how it can lead to violence in general, this universalist humanist part of the curriculum has succeeded well, but sadly we failed to actually teach people the larger story of the Jewish people, how the Holocaust was the most extreme example of a hatred that is an ongoing story for thousands of years, and that anti-Semitism is a unique form of hatred that morphs and reforms bechol dor vador in every generation. And although the outer form changes, it consistently is rooted in the same kind of core lies and conspiracy theories. So this thread of hatred that stretches across time like a thread pulled tight through history, even existing today. Just briefly, I'll say Haj Amin, the first Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who incited terrible pogroms on Jews in the land of Israel and throughout the Middle East in the 20s and 30s. The Grand Mufti lived for many years in Nazi Germany and studied under Adolf Hitler how to solve the Jewish problem in the Middle East. And we know that he was Yasser Arafat's most important mentor. And his Nazism influenced the hatred that is rampant today among groups like Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood. And so the only way we've ever known how to survive, besides by running away or fighting back, the only way we survive is by telling our story, whether it's through music or through telling stories, actual stories. The world must understand who we are and why we are. As we call the Torah our tree of life. It's our Eitz Chaim. And so let us now tell our stories. Let us remember who we are and why we are. Thank you, and I'll let you introduce Michael.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Let's now turn to today's speaker. It's a talented, nationally known composer and musician, Michael Schachter, who is sitting right there. Mike will be telling us about his musical theatrical project based on the history of the Terezín Ghetto, a World War II concentration camp near Prague, where Jewish inmates resisted the Nazis through musical, dramatic, and artistic expression. I think you'll find his presentation also an excellent complement to what many of you heard about Holocaust-related art from Janie Cohen at last month's Lunch and Learn. I should add also that Mike is a very engaged member of Ohavi Zedek. He is now on the board of directors, and he also helped in organizing a series of musical events that a number of us have been at to help support the Full Circle Preschool and the Lost Mural. When I think of Mike and his multiple talents, I also had the chance to look through his website, which I'd highly recommend to folks to get a sense of what else he's been working on. It's a very easy website name to remember, michaelschachter.com. So I hope that people will be able to take a few minutes and take a look at it later in the day or in the week. Mike's told me that his talk and presentation today will run about 35 minutes in length, and there'll be time for some Q&A after that. So with that, I'll welcome Mike to the mic.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thanks to Wayne for inviting me and organizing this amazing series. 1 second. The perils of height. Thanks to OZ and thanks to all of you guys for being here. I've been doing research on this topic on and off for well more than a decade. And as any of you who have waded into this or other Holocaust history know, there's an ocean of stories and depth and complications that are worth discussing. And in the interest of getting us out of here before dinner time, let alone finishing this meal, I'm going to try to just go through as quickly and as meaningfully as I can in this time, and we'll do my best to leave some time for questions and conversation at the end. Now, my journey with Terezin began, where else, with a family story. It is the spring of 2008, and I'm wrapping up my junior year of college. A few weeks prior, I had learned that I was accepted to study abroad German and music for a summer in Vienna. And I was excitedly preparing for my trip. One evening, my girlfriend at the time, who many of you now know as my eventual wife, Allie, yeah, time is a bitch, huh? She gets a call from her grandmother, her legendary grandma, Shirley Borenstein, who passed a few years ago at the age of 102. Now, Grandma Shirley had married a man called Herman Borenstein, not Allie's biological grandfather, who died young, but the only grandfather she ever knew. He was born in Germany in the 1920s. I wish I had a picture of him to share, but I don't. At the outset of World War II, his parents had managed to smuggle him onto a ship destined for America, promising that they and his sister would follow. He eventually arrived in Detroit alone, not a cent in his pocket, no identification in his pocket, 12 years old, and his parents and sister never arrived. He went on to live the American dream. He had children, grandchildren, remarried, had stepchildren, a prosperous small business, but he died of natural causes when Allie was in grade school and had never learned what became of his family. So back to the dorm room in 2008. Allie gets a call from Grandma Shirley, and she learns that Grandma Shirley had just gotten a letter from the USC Shoah Foundation. Apparently, they turned up a record of Herman Borenstein's long-lost father, Leo Borenstein, and traced him to a lesser-known camp outside Prague called Terezin, or Terezinstadt. Had we heard of it? No, neither of us had. But as it turns out, I was going to Vienna that summer. Allie and I were already planning a trip for her to join me for a week in Vienna, followed by some train travel around Eastern Europe. So we thought we would make a special visit and see if we could do any more digging. So fast forward to August. I was wrapping up my summer in Vienna, during which, among many other discoveries and experiences, a trip to the Jewish section of Vienna's Zentralfriedhof, the Central Cemetery. If any of you have ever been there, much of it, unlike the rest of the cemetery, is overgrown like this, and many graves still have bullet holes from the target practice during the Second World War. It inspired a choral orchestral piece, a setting of Ose Shalom, which has been performed a lot. And I was very much sort of in this contemplative space around my identity. And she joined me in Vienna. We made our way by rail to Prague and then on to Terezin. And there in the ghetto archives, we did indeed find a record of Leo Borenstein, his arrival, his date of liquidation to Auschwitz, and that he eventually died there. But also there, as we're perusing the Ghetto Museum, I look up and I come face to face with this image. A man named Rafael Schächter, who, as you can tell, might be a cousin of mine. He's one of the few Schächters hailing from the same region, which my own great-grandfather fled to America from in the early 1900s. Unclear if we're actually related. I strongly suspect we are, but I would have to go digging in the archives in Brăila, Romania, where he was born, and I have not made the time to do that yet. And also here in the Ghetto Museum, I learned that Terezin was a camp that was unique for its musical, artistic, and cultural activities. Much more on this shortly. I also learned that Rafael Schächter was a luminary in that musical establishment. He was a conductor, a pianist, a composer, and between 1941 and 1944 established himself as a musical and spiritual leader in ways large and small in the camps. The history books will tell you that he led many dozens of productions of cabarets, operas, and oratorios in the camp, most famously Verdi's Requiem. The accounts of fellow prisoners will also tell you that if you were a man and you arrived in your barracks after spending days stripped of your clothing, all your belongings, being transported there, shell-shocked, Rafael Schächter might gather you and your fellow inmates together and lead you in Czech and Jewish folk songs. And he would tell you that the Nazis might have dominion over your body or your movement, but not over your spirit. Now, I did not grow up in a musical family. My father and grandfather had very explicit dreams of me being the next Sandy Koufax or Hank Greenberg in the small but proud pantheon of Jewish ballplayers. And my quitting the baseball team in high school to focus on piano and theater was a seismic event in the family that was mentioned in several wedding toasts when I got married. But looking at Rafael Schächter's picture, it struck me in an instant that I was connected to something far beyond my immediate family, and that this possible cousin of mine was doing the very same activities that I was building a young career and identity around in the most extreme circumstances of human life imaginable. Now, in addition to this, Allie's family lore, passed down from Herman to Shirley, was that Leo Borenstein, great-grandfather, possessed an accomplished lyrical tenor voice. And it's not much of a stretch to assume he might have participated in the choirs in the camp led by Rafael Schächter, as many hundreds of musical inmates did. 3 generations later, Allie and I met singing in choir as undergraduates, and the rest is history. We're all living history. Now, I'd like to give you a brief historical overview of the Terezín Ghetto before I tell you more about some specific stories within the camp and my own creative work. So Terezín, or Theresienstadt in German, dates back to 1780, when the Habsburg Emperor Joseph II commissioned the building of a fortress to protect the empire against neighboring Prussian forces. It was named after his mother, the Empress Maria Theresa, and through the 19th century, it held a garrison of troops and eventually was used as a prison. It did not see any active battle or do the fortressing it was intended for, but it was a landmark that eventually birthed a civilian town. With the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918, it became a civilian town proper of a few thousand residents, part of Czechoslovakia. It had small businesses, people living normal lives. It even had a violin factory in its premises. After the annexation of Czechoslovakia in 1939 by the Nazis recognized its strategic and infrastructural advantages. It was first used as a Gestapo outpost and a prison starting in 1940, and by 1941, it was converted into a ghetto and concentration camp. Now, Terezín was never an extermination camp, but rather a transit camp, a way station in which Czech and Eastern European Jews would be held before being sent on to eventual extermination, usually in Auschwitz. Overall, about 150,000 total inmates were held in Terezín between 1941 and 1945. 33,000 died there, which is a pretty high number, just purely based on hunger, disease, conditions. A further 88,000 were then sent on by transport to Auschwitz, where they were killed, and 17,247 survived. Now, Terezín's conversion to a concentration camp and ghetto began in earnest in the fall of 1941. In November, the first wave of 342 Jews were transported into the camp. This group of Aufbaukommando, or construction officers, were mostly men, and they were chosen as most befitting the labor of refitting the barracks, kitchens, and other facilities to prepare for the eventual crowding of the ghetto. In addition to electricians, carpenters, engineers, early transports happened to include a number of young cultural luminaries. Gideon Klein, pianist and composer, Freddie Hirsch, a youth organizer, Bedra Fritta, a sketch artist, who most of the drawings for the rest of this presentation are drawings of Fritta drawn in the camp. Clarinetist Fritz Weiss, who was already world famous in his 20s. Karel Svenk, cabaret artist, and Rafael Schächter. Even before the camp was fully operational, these inmates organized ad hoc variety shows in the evenings after a hard day's labor, usually under Sphinx direction, skits and musical performances. And then through the fall of 1941 and much of 1942, as waves of transports brought Jewish prisoners to Terezin, 1,000 at a time, new arrivals were inducted into a thriving cultural underground. Attics, basements, courtyards held concerts, variety shows, and lectures, all managed by a careful system of lookouts to avoid Nazi detection. Naturally, musical instruments were strictly forbidden, so much of the activity was a cappella, vocal, and homespun, except for a few prized smuggled instruments. Rafael Schächter, it was written, would sneak under threat of death between the men's and women's barracks to conduct choir rehearsals for the respective men's and women's choirs in the evenings. But a few musical instruments did make their way into the ghetto, smuggled in pieces, including a double bass. In the summer of 1942, a huge stir was made when a legless piano, still working though, was discovered in a barrack corridor in which Gideon Klein gave an impromptu candlelight recital. Then, sometime in the summer of 1942, the inevitable happened. Word got back to the Nazis about the musical cultural activities happening in the ghetto. But rather than cracking down, in September of 1942, the Nazis formally condoned cultural activities, not only allowing musical instruments and formal public concertizing, but instructing the ghetto's Jewish self-government to form an official department of recreation to manage cultural activities. Now, it's still not entirely clear how this decision was made, but we do have a sense of the motivation. By 1942, the German war effort was already strained by the maintenance of several European fronts. It had recently tried to go into Russia, with both human and material resources stretched unsustainably. And at the same time, whispers about a network of concentration camps were percolating in the West. And while many world leaders were unwilling to publicly challenge Hitler, the International Red Cross was clamoring to inspect these concentration camps. And in particular, the King of Denmark was demanding accountability for Germany's intentions with its Jewish citizens. And perhaps through the shrewd intercession of Terezin's first Jewish chief elder, Jakob Edelstein, who worked very hard to hide the numbers of Jews who were being sent on rolls to spare 1 or 2 or 10 at a time. Or perhaps through the strategic wiles of Terezin's first Nazi commandant, Siegfried Seidel, on the top right, or Seidel's ambitious supervisor in Prague, Hans Günther, who is nicknamed the Smiling Executioner. The idea was proposed to Eichmann that Terezin would have maximal use to the Nazis in the court of public relations. It would serve as a so-called model ghetto, and it could thereby distract the prying eyes of the West. From the fall of 1942 through the beginning of 1944, cultural activities in Terezin blossomed. Orchestras, choirs, chamber groups, cabarets, a robust lecture series. A coffee house was erected in which singers and jazz groups entertained patrons who fought bitterly over a limited supply of tickets that they'd have to pay for with ghetto currency. By the beginning of 1944, the Terezín Ghetto, by some accounts, was host to more music and cultural activity than any other European city at the time. Despite the abject conditions, despite the perpetual fear of being disappeared onto transports to the mysterious East, despite Rafael Schächter's choirs continually diminishing in ranks and having to replenish his singers from concert to concert. In 1944, in January, the Nazis' intentions with Terezin started to become more manifest. A new commandant, Karl Rahm, was appointed, and under his direction, the ghetto underwent a months-long project of Verschönerung, or beautification. In part, this consisted of Germanification. Despite the Council of Elders largely being German-speaking to interface with the Nazis, the predominant Czechness and Eastern Europeanness of the camp was distasteful to Rahm, and he insisted on the creation of a German cabaret under the direction of new celebrity inmate Kurt Geron. He was at that time a famous actor and director, sort of the Jack Black of his day, and incidentally, he sang the first ever Mac the Knife in Weil's Threepenny Opera, which you can hear on Spotify, actually. But this beautification also largely consisted of an elaborate makeover to the camp, planting grass, painting fences, erecting the fronts of schoolhouses, restaurants, banks, none of which were actually operational, of course. It was a Potemkin village to create the superficial facsimile, of a thriving city. This picture was taken in the spring of 1944, by the way. The result was not a far cry from the famous scene in Mel Brooks's Blazing Saddles, when the sheriff lures the outlaws into the duplicate of the town. Now, why go through all this trouble? On June 6th, 1944, 3 delegates of the International Red Cross were brought into Terezin for a day-long inspection. Ram escorted the inspectors through a carefully curated itinerary with stops at the coffee house for some jazz, to Guérin's cabaret, and finally to a cafeteria converted into a concert hall where Rafael Schächter, that's him conducting right there, conducting a full performance of Verdi's Requiem. And I'm just going to play a little excerpt of Verdi's Requiem now to imagine if you're going to put yourself in the position of being in a camp like this, being hungry, starving, dealing with everything that you're dealing with, and this is what you're hearing. Cover your ears. As you can see in this very interesting sketch by Frida, there was a vast difference between what was seen by the Red Cross and what was there behind the surface. Corpses and other evidence of the extreme privation and crowding were carefully hidden. Children were coached to say, "Uncle Ram, sardines again," whenever they passed by. And these are pictures taken by the Red Cross inspectors. Ultimately, despite Chief Elder Paul Epstein managing to pull an inspector aside for a coded conversation indicating that all wasn't what it seemed, the ruse was a success. The Red Cross gave Terezin a glowing report, concluding that the Jews indeed were well treated and thriving in a model society. Buoyed by the success of this ruse, the Nazis doubled down on Terezin as a propaganda weapon, coercing Kurt Guérin into directing a sham documentary, Der Führer schenkt den Juden eine Stadt, literally, Hitler gives the Jews a city. In August and September of 1944, Guérin and a film crew captured footage of orchestras, jazz, including a group I'm about to talk about, lectures, a children's opera, Brundibar, that's in the bottom right, and a soccer match. To lift the spirits of his actors, many of whom were gaunt with hunger, exhaustion, and fear, he would shake his prodigious belly to get them to laugh. By the end of September 1944, the Nazi war effort was rapidly deteriorating. The Germans were hastening to accelerate and consolidate the efforts to exterminate the Jews. Upon Guérin delivering the final reel of film, Ram immediately ordered the mass liquidation of Terezin's remaining prisoners to Auschwitz, including a shocked Guérin himself, apparently having been reneged on an apparent quid pro quo to keep him and his family protected. Mass transports to Auschwitz began on Yom Kippur of 1944, with the Jewish prisoners singing Kol Nidre on the train platform, awaiting their uncertain fate. The vast majority, including all that we have discussed so far, would not survive. Now, there's far more to unpack in this history than we have time for, as I mentioned, but I did want to talk about a couple key issues that are of interest to me. One is the fascinating portrait of life in the ghetto that emerges from both historical scholarship and survivor accounts. For me, it was shocking to learn all this, that I had grown up, even having gone through Hebrew school, learned about Auschwitz and the Holocaust, and having it be foreign to me. Not just the facts of it, but the feeling of it. For one thing, a common theme was that life in Terezin was experienced as a kind of limbo, where time and real life, as it were, stood still. And some nicknamed the experience as the waiting room to hell. But beyond this, what emerges from surviving documentation is that prison society there was much more complex and colorful than a cultural imagination that, for me, was shaped by Schindler's List or Shoah. It was not a black and white aberration or a departure from history, as I was often, I think, acculturated to believe. This is a society demonstrating the full mess of humanity in all of its glories and frailties. Power dynamics, class dynamics, ethnic dynamics, sexual barter, but also touchingly in the sorts of love affairs and recipe swapping and petty jealousies that we might imagine would be too quotidian for a life or death situation like this, but in fact was the stuff of life that was keeping people going day to day. One of my favorite documents in my research that I found was a diary entry by Viktor Ullmann, a composer and the ghetto's de facto music critic. And he was humorously detailing the friction between two rival chamber music groups, I think they were string quartets, that were engaging in some competitive shenanigans to jockey for the scarce rehearsal space. But omnipresent also amongst all of this, both in casual conversations in daily life and in scripts that survive from the cabaret stages, is gallows humor, often quite vacuous and shockingly silly, like the real birthplace of what we grew to see in the Borscht Belt, Catskill comics, and what then blossomed into stand-up culture and a lot of American culture through Seinfeld all the way back. And this is nothing more or less than the stuff of life and survival for all these people in Terezin. Another issue, which is unavoidable with this history, is the complexity of making moral sense of these musical and cultural activities. Were the Jews in the camp heroes, defying the Nazis through both political and spiritual resistance? Or were they collaborators, as some have written, wittingly or unwittingly culpable for helping further the Nazis' propaganda aims? To me, the question is fascinating and does not seem to be an either or, maybe both, maybe neither. Certainly the inmates themselves made distinctions. They lionized Schächter as a hero for his daring programming of Verdi's Requiem to spite Eichmann to his face, as well as Viktor Ullmann for his transgressive opera Der Kaiser von Atlantis, which very clearly lampooned Hitler, while many felt betrayed by Guérin, whom they perceived as not only selfishly cooperating with the propaganda film to try to save his own skin, but also appearing to them to enjoy the director's chair a little bit too much. But to me, this question is also secondary to a deeper idea that isn't easy to see in our contemporary society, which is the idea of music and cultural as fundamental to survival and human identity. There are, of course, indeed stories of lives that are literally saved by participation in musical activity, and one of which I'll be telling you shortly. But beyond that, it's clear from historical and survivor accounts that the daily act of rehearsing, performing, and experiencing music and art was absolutely crucial to keeping mind and heart intact, having the will to make it through the day. What's confirmed here is that music, art, drama, culture, these are not luxuries. These are basic needs. They're absolutely essential to our human identity and meaning. It's how we make our most important memories, both personal and cultural. They're how we mark the landmarks of our lives from birth to marriage to death. They're how we understand one another as humans in society, connected with humans past and present and future, and our environment. They're how we make sense of our mortality in the face of an indifferent universe. Now, as I mentioned, there are far too many stories from Terezin interesting to tell. I'm happy to get into more of those in the question time. But for now, I'm going to settle for one, which is the center of my current musical theatrical project based on this history. This is Eric Vogel. He was born in 1896 and raised in Brno, the second largest city in Czechoslovakia. By the time the Second World War rolled around, he was quite possibly the most interesting man in Brno. He was an engineer by trade. He was also a trumpeter and famed record collector at the time, where jazz and other things from the United States were relatively scarce. He was also the table tennis coach for the Maccabi Club and the Czech national team, which won multiple world championships under his coaching. Now, Vogel happened to be in love with one of the stars of the Czech national team, Trudy, or Gertrude, And she won a world championship in mixed doubles herself, as well as 2 team world championships in 35 and 36, with Vogel as her coach. However, unlucky for Vogel, Trudy was betrothed to this fellow, Jacques Schallinger, the head of athletics at the Maccabee Club and Vogel's boss there. For Vogel, music, sport, and culture were the reason to live, and by his own later account, a welcome distraction from the ominous political winds that were swirling at the time. In March of 1939, history came for Vogel and Brno as the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia. During the day of invasion, roving Gestapo terrorized Jewish neighborhoods with Kristallnacht-like pogroms in Prague and Brno, destroying storefronts, committing arson, including setting Brno's historic Great Synagogue ablaze, and administering wanton beatings, arrests, and even killings. Vogel hunkered down in his parents' apartment as Gestapo raided the building, but he was spared a grisly fate when the stormtrooper who pounded on the door happened to be an admirer of his, recognizing Vogel from the jam session and nightlife scene. As Brno settled into Nazi occupation, Vogel's engineering firm was dissolved, and Jews were forced into a ghetto of a few square city blocks. Vogel and his parents had to share their modest 2-bedroom apartment with several other displaced families. And to make money for food rations, Vogel clandestinely kept arranging and writing music, working particularly with Bobek Bryan, who was a bandleader who, as a non-Jew, was still able to perform and record. One evening, Vogel was out past curfew, working with the Bryan band, and 3 Gestapo men happened to burst into the rehearsal on a routine raid. Discovering Vogel's identity, he was beaten and dragged into the Gestapo prison, where he again was spared by the same stormtrooper admirer. And all he wanted in return is he brought Vogel to his house, and they had quite possibly the most awkward hangout in existence, where they marched him into his apartment, and all he wanted to do was listen to jazz and drink and talk about how different it would be if only Vogel weren't Jewish. After surviving occupation, Vogel was finally rounded up and sent to Terezin in May of 1942, where he quickly connected with Fritz Weiss and other jazzers prominent in the underground music scene. In the fall of 1942, musical activities and instruments were suddenly condoned within Terezin, and on January 8, 1943, he submitted the following letter to the Freizeitgestaltung, or the Recreation Department, requesting permission to form a jazz band. You might see here that he details the instrumentation. It'll be a 7-piece band, and he names the instruments and who he anticipates will be playing those instruments. And he titles the group the Ghetto Swingers. The request was approved, and almost immediately the Ghetto Swingers became a fixture in the cultural firmament, performing at the newly erected coffee house and the band shell in the town square. This is a poster from one of their performances. Due to their prominence, Vogel and the rest of the Ghetto Swingers were afforded a measure of safety and protection from the regular rhythm of transports to Auschwitz, but at a price. They were also conscripted into the Nazi propaganda schemes, performing for the Red Cross in June of 1944, and then featuring in the sham documentary months later. However, for this, I selfishly, as a scholar, am grateful, because this panorama image here is cobbled together from a few frames of the documentary. We can see, a little blurred out, that's Vogel blaring away on the trumpet right there, and I can name the other musicians later. But what you're about to hear is the only surviving audio of the Ghetto Swingers from this documentary. This is fragments sort of stitched together in a Frankenstein way of them performing by Mir Bistishane.
Verbringt bei strahlender Sonne jeder gerne ein paar Stunden seiner Freizeit.
That's it. Those 90 seconds are all that remain of the Ghetto Swingers today. In October 1944, Vogel was liquidated along with most of the rest of the Ghetto Swingers to Auschwitz. As he waited in line among the haggard arrivals, Vogel struck up a conversation, as was his wont, with a nearby Nazi guard. Upon learning that Vogel was a trumpeter, the guard mused that Vogel might be of use in the Auschwitz prison orchestra, and under that guard's instructions, when he reached the front of the line, Vogel lied to Mengele about his health and his age, and was indeed sorted away from the gas chambers. He stayed alive in Auschwitz by playing in the prisoner orchestra, reuniting with the pianist you just heard, Martin Roman, who also was a famous, well-known pianist at the time, who had joined him in the Ghetto Swingers in 1944 and had already made it to Auschwitz earlier. There, Vogel played as entertainment for the SS troops. Without sheet music, they played a potpourri of improvisations, remembered fragments from concert hall classics, and popular German tunes. After some time in Auschwitz, Vogel, by this point, weighed under 100 pounds, and he struggled to get air through his horn. With Allied forces advancing in late 1944 and early 1945, he was evacuated from Auschwitz, carted on transport after transport to an uncertain end. Eventually, in early 1945, he found himself on a train to Dachau, where he likely faced extermination. He decided, again, this is a moment against his want. In his memoirs, he writes about how he was continually willing, both before and during his time in Terezin, to be an ostrich and stick his head in the sand and enjoy himself in his music. And he realized at this moment that he had to actually take direct action. And as the train was rounding a slow bend in the tracks, he leapt off the train, evading the machine gun fire and the dogs they released in the forest to chase him, and he survived in the January winter. Within a week, he had made his way into a farmhouse, and you can see him here a couple months after his rescue, having regained already quite a bit of weight. You might be wondering what happened to Trudy, his unrequited love. Now, Trudy had also been imprisoned in Terezin. She and Schallinger were among the earliest arrivals in December of 1941, and there is little record of her activities in the ghetto, aside from some mention of her assisting with soccer and other sporting activities through the recreation department. There is also little record of how much interaction she and Vogel had during their time in the ghetto. But what we do know is this. Between 1942 and 1944, Trudy's relationship with Schallinger broke down irreparably. We don't know the exact contours of the breakdown, but we can speculate. Schallinger abused his position of power within the ghetto self-government to sexually extort at least one of the subordinates, a personal acquaintance of Trudy in the camp named Erna Frischmanova. And as I said before, in Terezin, we can behold the full mess of humanity. We also know that Trudy and Schallinger left Terezin for Auschwitz on separate transport days apart in October of 1944, which was highly unusual for married couples. Schallinger was immediately sent to the gas chambers upon arrival in Auschwitz, but Trudy managed to survive. Little is known about her time in Auschwitz, but by June of 1945, she had been liberated and made her way back to a war-ravaged Brno. There, she and Vogel reunited, and not long after that, they were married in a small civil ceremony. This is a picture outside the courthouse, right after they got married. And from there, they made their way to New York, the world's capital of Vogel's beloved jazz. Vogel would go on to play and write about jazz for decades, serving as a critic for his beloved Downbeat magazine, where he also published a short memoir of his Holocaust experiences across 1961 and 1962 issues. Unfortunately, life after the camps was harder for Trudy than it was for the ever-bubbly Vogel. Like many survivors, she never fully recovered. Traumatized and chronically ill, she died in 1976 at the age of 57. Vogel died a few years later at the age of 84. And today they rest together in Las Vegas. They never really did get a proper happily ever after, but unlike most, at the very least, they did get an ever after. Now, I'm going to conclude today with a brief overview of 3 projects I'm currently involved with related to Terezin. First is a music theater work, focusing primarily on Vogel's story and the Ghetto Swingers, with ancillary stories including Vogel's love triangle with Trudy and Schallinger, Rafael Schächter's pursuit of resistance through musical performance, and Kurt Garan's descent into collaboration. While I've been researching Vogel since his story was published in a terrific 2019 article in The New Yorker by Amanda Petrusic, I can share the link with anybody if you're interested in reading more, This particular adaptation started in 2021 as a project for television, actually. With theaters closed in the first 18 months of COVID, I started working with a couple production companies to try to realize the story as a limited series. But then, right at the point at which we were trying to recruit directors and pitch to networks, in 2023, Hollywood experienced strikes and industry contraction, and since then, we've pivoted back to developing it for the theater. It's a more natural home. These are a few images of other Terezin-related theatrical works over the years, including a recent revival up here on the top right, The Last Cyclist, which was written by Carol Svank in the camp and performed in the camp. The development process for this piece will take a while yet, given the giant scale of the themes and the absolute care needed to render not just these themes, but more generally Jewish pain on stage and what it means to use that in performance. But this is a life's work sort of project for me, and in my view, it should take as long as it needs to take. More immediately, at present, I'm hard at work on a 40-minute oratorio for choir and orchestra, which will premiere in June of 2026. Entitled Terezín Requiem, in honor of both The Lives Lost and Rafael Schächter's Requiem project in particular, this work will be scored for the same orchestral forces as Verdi's Requiem and set a selection of Stoic-themed texts, in particular drawing from themes in Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, a book which grew out of the author's experience in Terezin. After premiering in Berkeley, California next year, the plan is to bring the work to Prague and Terezin itself in the summer of 2027. And then finally, this past March and April, I had the absolute privilege of working with an organization called Violins of Hope. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Violins of Hope is a nonprofit that rescues and restores instruments, mostly violins, from the Holocaust. They partner with orchestras all around the country to present musical and educational programming around the stories of the instruments in their collection, as well as the Holocaust more generally. For the past couple months, the violins have been residents in Knoxville, Tennessee, where many were on display in a special exhibit. And partnering with professional actors, as you can see here, and the Knoxville Symphony, they put on a program in March and April at the historic Tennessee Theater in downtown Knoxville, featuring music composed or performed in the camps, as well as relevant music by Jewish composers. And all of the members of Knoxville Symphony's violin section performed on the very instruments that were rescued from the camps, each of which is worthy of a dissertation or documentary in its own right. Now, for this program, I was commissioned to contribute a short orchestral piece based on my research, and I composed a piece called Four for Gideon, a reimagining of 4 Czech and Polish folk tunes that Gideon Klein had arranged for men's choir while in Terezin. The tunes are timeless, plain-spoken, and joyful. Hearing them sing sweetly from the violin sections on instruments that actually experienced this history and these very horrors was almost too overwhelming to bear. I'm going to wrap it up there, but I look forward to your questions. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you, and thanks again.
Thanks so much. That was a terrific presentation, and I hopefully the congregation can at some point see one of your productions when you're at that stage.
Absolutely.
Hopefully not in 10 or 20 years, but sooner. We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. Anyone has any? We're going to be using the mic, so as this is being recorded.
So when the Red Cross went into the camp and they gave an okay, was it universal, or was there any other research that showed that some of them really knew what was really going on there? Was there any hints given to them that this is all facade?
As I mentioned briefly in the talk, at that time, the chief elder of the camp was a man named Paul Epstein. He did pull one of the inspectors aside and in coded language hinted to them, hey, you might want to go peek behind this thing, or hey, stuff is off here. And nothing came of it. And there were 3 inspectors who came in, and the report was unanimous. And actually, I believe it was in 1980, Claude Lanzmann, who went on to make the documentary Shoah, who many of you have seen, I'm guessing, went to the home of Maurice Rossel, who is one of those inspectors, and you can watch this very uncomfortable interview he gives Rossel, in which he challenges him, like, how could you not have known? How could you not have seen? And Rossel doubles down. He says, you would have given the same report. Yeah.
When we were there at the concentration camp, there was a crematorium. Did they build that after the Red Cross was there?
In Terezin?
Yeah.
No, I don't believe so. But I also don't believe it was used for the prisoners who were there. So operational at Terezin, there was the ghetto holding Jewish inmates. There was also across the river what was called the small fortress, which was used as basically a Gestapo prison, both for inmates who were not behaving or needed to be taught a lesson, or for people outside of the ghetto as well.
I don't know if you have any evidence of this in your research, but I know from my own experience as a choral singer that the Verdi Requiem is not an easy piece. So my question for you, if you, or maybe you have evidence or you can speculate, the singers who came in because Schachter had to rotate them in and out very quickly, and obviously did not have a lot of rehearsal time. Do you have any speculation on how familiar the piece of music was with people and the singers, and if this is something that is it based on, it was a common piece that people had learned to sing, and so singing it in this kind of environment with very little rehearsal and very little tools, is it something they knew, or was this just the magic of Schachter getting all these people together to sing?
As far as we know, it was Schachter being an irrepressible force, that for much of Terezin's history, there was no sheet music at all. And even during the period that they were regularly performing the Requiem, I think it was performed somewhere between 10 and 20 times in the ghetto, including at the Red Cross visit.
16.
Most of the performances, most of the singers were learning by rote, drilled into them in rehearsals. And this is among many other complex works.
Yeah.
Smetana's Bartered Bride, like full operas that people were learning by rote. And there are diary accounts where people will remember at 7 in the morning or earlier at dawn being shaken awake by Schachter, being like, "It's go time, we got to rehearse right now." And I think that it was the thing that they woke up for first in the morning that was keeping them going during the day of labor, that they would retreat to in the evening. So there was quite a lot of rehearsal, even if it wasn't as efficient or how we would recognize rehearsal now.
Oh, for sure, thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you share any thoughts about how this learning has influenced your current composing? I know that's really a huge question, but any details you can provide would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the couple pieces I mentioned towards the end are more direct, where I'm going through sources, I'm finding folk songs, I'm actually taking explicit musical materials and working them into the piece. But I think more generally, a lot of it has been more passive and osmotic, like the sort of the spirit of this seeping into it. I think it has definitely motivated me in my writing, both within Jewish themes and my own Jewish identity, or in projects I'm doing not related to Jewish history or Jewish identity, thinking about music beyond just what sounds good, what notes I might choose, but also music as, not even a political act, but just as a sort of radical humanist act of that, for whatever reason, we find these vibrations pleasing enough that they bind us together to rehearse things and perform and share in a community together, and it makes sense to us and our brains and our bodies. And I think the power of what music meant in a situation like that really changed my own orientation to it in terms of what it means to devote a life to it and what it can do in all of our daily lives to keep us going.
One last question.
Could you describe the plans for the November weekend with Liova and how this research has influenced your communications and your dialogue relating to planning for the event?
Oh, sure. So Aaron is referring to a concert we're going to put together in November with the Lost Mural Foundation in honor of their 10th anniversary. There's a phenomenal violinist, violist, composer named Liova, who himself is an immigrant refugee from the Soviet Union. And he'll be coming up to Burlington. He'll be in residence for a few days, and both giving concerts here and working with local students. It's funny, I don't think we've discussed Terezin specifically, but the degree of sort of instant connection and understanding that he and I shared upon meeting and tossing musical ideas around, the kinds of things that we recognize in one another's work, and the ease of sort of going from a point of meeting and purpose to like, let's get out and do action, I think comes from this sort of shared understanding of history. And I hope that you guys will all come, because the kind of work he does both sort of sociologically around it and in his music as well is motivated by this very same kind of stuff.
I just wanted to remind people that CCTV, Town Meeting Television, is very generously filmed this, and it should be available in a week or two. We'll post an announcement, because this is the kind of talk that I think a lot of people would appreciate hearing, even if they weren't able to make it here today. So thank you again, Mike. I really appreciate your time in doing the presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
There's also the contribution bucket. If you haven't contributed $10 or so, Judy is holding that right there. Thank you.